And we should be switching over to your screen now, Todd.
Okay, can you see my slides and the opening screen?
Looks great. You sound great. Yep.
All right, thanks, Bruce. Appreciate the opportunity to speak on this subject again. And I apologize if anyone has seen this before. I have presented it to some service hydrologists around the country, some WCMs, and then at a couple of conferences. So again, appreciate everyone kind of focusing in on a topic that about 10 years ago, me and my counterpart, Tim Halbach at the Milwaukee office kind of took on the idea of looking much closer at US flood fatalities and kind of the nuts and bolts of what goes into them. So that's going to be what my presentation is. I know this slide is a little dated, but I always kind of liked going to this back in fiscal year 16 when we had so many big heavy rain events. And the thing I want you to kind of look at, again, this is again 3-5 years old here, but is the number of fatalities each one of these events holds along the bottom. And we see so much attention from tornado outbreaks and winter storms and, you know, and hurricanes, rightfully so right now. But I sometimes think we lose the vision of that flood fatalities are happening a lot out there, you know, and then more recently you've got Hurricane Harvey, I think it was Hurricane Florence in the Carolinas, and it sometimes doesn't have to be a big heavy rain event. It could be the monsoon season in the desert Southwest that leads to multiple fatalities. Of course, flooding is a very costly endeavor as well. You know, you get into hailstorms and flooding, but the frequency of billion-dollar flood disasters is huge, unfortunately. When we talk about fatalities and different weather hazards, of course, that we deal with here in the National Weather Service, these are the 30-year trend numbers kind of updated here. And when I was updating these, it's interesting how many of these have actually dropped. We've heard, if any of you have been attending the NWA talks this week, there's a poster about how lightning fatalities are down. But tornado numbers are down a little bit, but sadly, the flood numbers continue to rise. And so you can see where the flooding is still, and we're talking about direct flood fatalities, is still a huge concern and should be, I think, sometimes more of a focus. So a little bit of what went into some of this data crunching, if you will, is it was modeled after the work that John Jensensis used to do. He used to be the WCM up at Gray, Maine, and he would track lightning fatality information and then pass that along in near real time to the WCMs around the country. And it as a WCM, it was so handy to have that kind of updated information. And so we started doing this with flood fatalities. It's not quite as easy because of the direct versus indirect challenge, but we've been doing this since about 2010. So a lot of the data you'll see here is admittedly a little more recent. It may not be as back in the data books as some research has done, but again, we're going into some of these fatalities in much more detail. So what I typically do and what others that have helped me do is we monitor media reports. We have Google News searches set up, but we also cross and compare with storm data that's out there, and of course with the WFOs. We could talk separately about the issues in storm data. Certainly the TWIP project has brought into some of the tornado documenting and issues there, but I see some problems too with flood entries. And then you also have, you know, like WFO San Juan and getting information out of Puerto Rico sometimes with tropical systems can also be delayed. But what I try to do then, taking this information, is provide meteorologists and hydrologists near real-time fatality information to improve outreach education. And it's also kind of worked twofolds. It's also helped, I think, improve the storm data database because we've gone through some of these cases, cleaned up maybe some unintentional errors, but also been able to add information that might not have normally got into our numbers. And between the audience here and me, I still think some of our flood fatality reporting is a little bit underreported, but so be that. Anyway, the bottom line is it's just amazing how sad and how amazed that these fatalities are somewhat routine. Now, you know, before I get into the data, I just wanted to show this graphic that one of our forecasters at our office, Clinton Agerder, put together, where he kind of took all of the flood fatalities that we had in the database and kind of plotted it spatially across the country and by service area for the National Weather Service offices. And you can kind of see that connection between the tropics and the convective conveyor belt there through the maybe southern, southeastern parts of the region, but southern plains of Texas and into the East Coast. But let's look at some of the specifics here. First of all, fatalities by year. Again, most of this data only goes back to 2010, but you can see the high numbers here, and this year so far, we've actually documented 41. If you break the numbers down by gender, I don't think this is much surprise to people, but males make up roughly 2/3 of the fatalities out there. There is kind of some social research that goes into the risk-taking behavior of males. Certainly, sometimes I'll joke at a conference that maybe the men are trying to save their women counterparts. I don't know, but anyway, you can see that the fatalities here. And if you actually take the percentage of male fatalities through the years, it's pretty consistent. It's about 2/3 of all fatalities. Interestingly enough, so far in 2020, there is one more female fatality than male, so that the numbers are a little skewed this year. I don't have the reasons behind that, but most of the time it is male fatalities about 2/3 of the time there. When we look at months and try to get into the seasonal here, again, I don't think there's much surprise here, but these are the total number of fatalities that we've documented. And you can clearly see the convective ramp up across the country and the tropical influence as we go into the late summer and into the fall here. And if we look at those average by month, you kind of average those out, again, the same kind of spikes as you get into your peak, I guess you could say the severe weather season, convective season, and then the tropical influence. Now, when you look at age, and past research has also kind of been all over the board with fatalities by age, but even though you can see maybe some pattern to the age limits here, I don't really, from year to year, really don't see anything that stands out. There is a young child influence, I suppose, from drowning, unfortunate circumstances, and then there seems to be this kind of middle to late age peak. But for the most part, it's relatively or more uniform than a lot of other statistics out there. Now, I think from a messaging point of view, and one of the more interesting facets is, of course, the activity related to these fatalities. And I know we all advertise that driving into high water is the majority of the flood-related fatalities, and that holds true, certainly. But when you look at, like sheltering is only 10% of the fatalities, but then you have walking, people falling in, and then there's quite a bit in what I would consider the other category, because there's just so many different circumstances that are involved with drownings. And again, these are direct fatalities, not necessarily indirect, but a direct fatality. So when you look at driving, again, those numbers, those percentages are pretty high from year to year. What I showed you on the previous slide was kind of the total through the time, but here you can see just the driving fatalities. It's pretty consistent year after year. And by the way, we didn't go all the way back to 2010 on activities, and so that's why the year starts at 2011 in these. So I had a forecaster at a conference once ask me, well, have you ever broken down like the percentage of when people are proactively or making the poor choice of going to high water versus the water coming to them? And so if you break down that activity, it's roughly 90%. So again, 90% of these direct related flood fatalities are caused because people are making a conscious choice or a choice to go into high water. And so maybe, instead of just saying that driving into high water is an issue, something like this where people are somehow purposely or taking the risk of going into high water makes up 90% of fatalities. Another suggestion, and certainly more research I need to do, is have you looked at the time of day of these fatalities? And for this type of data, I have not gone back as far yet, but I have started keeping closer tabs on the time, if I can find it in the documentation, going back to 2019 through this year. And so it makes up roughly 44 cases. And I think this might come as a surprise if I plot this out through the timeline. There is not really, at least again, this is a short data set, but not a clean signal that it's only a darkness issue, it's only a nighttime issue. There are a lot of cases of daytime instances, and maybe an argument that commute times, commuting to work early in the mornings, going about their daytime activities, or in the evening too. There's been a lot of those cases. So, and we'll talk a little bit about routine cases. Now, speaking of cases, I have numerous case examples. Again, I try to document, and so I could go on for a long time sharing case examples. I just brought a few here. Most of these are more interesting cases and or cases with multiple fatalities, a lot of which happened in the region, in central region here. 2014, again, a family of three going to the family's house and making a conscious decision to go through high water. A couple cases from 2015 in Utah where you had a secular family here where their vans were caught in flash floods. And the same flash flooding in one of the national parks with hikers caught in some of those steep canyons. Back in Tennessee, teenagers, driving along this road, getting caught in a flooded creek. In Illinois, 2015, again, family related, people leaving a family reunion, I believe, and going through high water and getting swept away. You have a couple military cases at Ft.Leonard Wood, Missouri, international soldiers maybe not accustomed to the signage that we use in the country getting swept away, and another case like that in Fort Hood, Texas. I do know that the military, especially the Army, has done a lot more revisiting of the procedures during low water or crossings and high water scenarios. Again, just a few more. I'm purposely going through these fast, but a lot of cases, of course, were people driving around barricades. Law enforcement instances where they unfortunately were swept away. Here's another case from Kansas, father and son, swept away. And this case here from Marion in August of 2018 is very interesting. You had a couple, they were in their pickup truck, they were driving along and they saw a stranded motorist. So the gentleman got out, he strapped a rope to his truck and was going in, wading in the high water to rescue the driver. Meanwhile, his girlfriend got out of the pickup. She starts by videotaping in the pickup and then gets out and unfortunately is swept away. So in the process of rescuing someone else, his girlfriend made the poor decision of getting out, and they found her later. There's a case here from South Carolina where law enforcement waved another law enforcement van carrying two prisoners around a barricade, and they ended up drowning. Here's a grandmother from Indiana, and more recently, a case where a family driving even a big Army military-sized truck in Arizona tried to go through high water. It overturns, and several of the small children unfortunately drowned. More recently in Missouri, again, another case where a father made a poor choice and swept away on this low water crossing, and two young boys in the family drowned. And even this spring, a group of Amish kids mainly in Kentucky that lost their lives. So a lot of sad cases there. And of course, the question is, why does this keep occurring? And this is where the complexity comes into play. Is it simply a nighttime issue? Is it people that are just not being patient? Is it the aggressive, again, behavior of some drivers just feeling like they need to get through? Is it, navigation apps that are steering people in these locations and steering people along their routes without letting people think it through? Or is it just fear and people lock up and they don't know what to do? It's likely a variety of these types of things. And there's a lot of research out there. I'm just, kind of digging into this or skimming the surface of what has been done. There's some excellent articles by Rachel Carr and others called Effectively Communicating Risk and Uncertainty to the Public. And more recently in the Journal of Weather, Climate, and Society in July of this year, there's this excellent article that just came out from Ashley Coles at TCU Texas Christian University on driving into danger and the perception of communicating flash flood risks. So a lot of times it's people needing to personalize that risk, and people are so different in how they react to uncertainty. There's really no one way that this happens, and that adds a challenge to us in the messaging world, certainly. The influences to their risk behavior go off past experience, what alternatives are available, sometimes just the urgency that's involved in that particular driver, their perceived environment conditions, and maybe what vehicle they're in, as we saw with the family that thought they were safer driving an Army vehicle. There's a lot of peer influence, of course. What are others doing? You know, we all know from the warning world that people are going to seek out multiple sources of information and try to make their own confirmations of what's going on, but they're going to see what others are doing, and that socialization issue is huge. And so we have to kind of work with that in our challenge from the National Weather Service side of things. And then there's this self-efficacy side of things, excuse me, about do people feel like they're invincible, or do they think like they're powerless? It gets back to that fear issue, that they just make the wrong decision. So it's very confusing. So, you know, what can we do? Well, one of the things that kind of bothers me out there is the media influences of how they report on flooding. I think a lot of the reporting is kind of, it's more, I don't know, peered, more trying to get ratings, I don't know, but the decision making here in all these cases gives people mixed signals. And this particular reporter here is standing away from it, maybe advertising that certain roads are closed is much safer. We've all heard about the bus driver incidences. And here you've got, again, maybe an education issue and revisiting their protocols with schools. The Texas issue, again, this video went pretty viral where you know, it's their normal route. And again, that gets back to the idea of people in their routines seems to be the main issue here. And these bus drivers, that's their routine. And so they might not think it through that they shouldn't take that route. Maybe navigational apps. I talked a little bit about that too, but there's more and more getting out on that about be careful using those because they might not update for weather type alerts out there. So again, what are we supposed to do at the forecast office? Well, there's a lot of good examples and things being done around the country. Here is in Austin, Texas, where they map out their low water crossings. Again, I don't know how well all these works, but it's interesting ideas. Some more flood networks, some mapping. Again, a lot of different examples out of the Fargo Grand Forks area. You know, they might have these types of meters on different upstream gauges. All kinds of different campaigns out there. And if any of you have been watching the NWA conference too, I did have to give a shout out to the Springfield office, and they did a nice poster on the Flood Diagnostic Innovation Project where they are looking at their low water crossings very specifically and getting into the details of, you know, how each one of these handles water and handles situations differently. So that's very interesting. The education that we try to put out there, we have safety awareness weeks, we do campaigns, we do talks at some of our spotter training or other safety. You know, we have the Weather Ready Nation and Turnaround Don't Drown campaign is of course huge, but you know, sometimes I think we need to look at this and see what can we improve on. You've got these other projects, the Silver Jackets, again, Storm Ready initiatives, flood awareness presentations that are being done in some parts of the country. So there's a lot of different things going on, and of course, social media. Some very interesting and unique different social media, and I would give kudos to all the offices that, again, try to revisit this and try to come up with unique messaging. Some examples, maybe not from the United States, but here's an interesting one from down under Australia. You know, you wouldn't want to drive into a bushfire, so why are you driving into a flash flood? Some examples that I got out of the Las Vegas office and things that going out in Nevada. Some, you know, fun puns on license plates, but different ideas there. And then more recently with some of the flooding in Texas, I happen to see these where police departments are actually, again, they're using that Turnaround Don't Drown campaign, but they're actually listing out low water crossings. The effectiveness, not sure, but I think it's an interesting approach. It's trying to be proactive, which is something that I've seen more and more here in recent years. I think it's a good direction. So again, what can we do? We've got signage, we've got barricades. Here's an example where they're getting new barricades, and this was the example of it. Is that really going to make a difference in some cases? There's all kinds of different types of barricades and varieties out there, but yet in 2019, here's another example where they drove around these in this case 3 or 4 different levels of barricades and still ended up drowning. So again, different types of barricades, different parts of the country, different parts of the world. In some cases, you might have a variety of signs, multiple signs, probably a little better. In this kind of gate here, you've got a depth meter, flood, a road may flood. Well, does multiple signals help deter people? Using law enforcement, that could work as well. But the problem there is, of course, you have to be there. It takes away the law enforcement's time, but that might be the only way you can stop people. They've come up with these stupid motorist laws, about fining people when they drive around barricades. But again, I've seen a lot of cases where it continues. So how do you enforce that? There have been cases where people have been fined, like this case from North Carolina last year, where they did survive, but after they were rescued, they were ticketed for careless and reckless driving. So there's attempts to get this out, but is it really changing behavior? So sometimes I wonder if we physically have to stop people. I talked about the law enforcement, but gate closures. There's a couple examples here. If it's going to be a longer term flood, is it something that you need to bring in hard barriers, cement-like barriers? Or as I've kind of preached with secondary road groups or highway departments, can you just simply take a big pile of gravel, go dump it on a road, and then you can pretty easily clean it up once the road is not underwater anymore, because it just physically might stop people from going into that high water. Is the trick lights and gates? I mean, again, there's some very unique and interesting expenditures out there, but that might stop people from when they know that there's flooding going on out there. And then you have the more extravagant things like pop-up levees in some parts of the country that probably would physically stop people. So a few things to kind of ponder on here, the trends that people are still choosing to drive into high water, and there certainly remains a lack of education out there. But as we talked about, asserting risk and figuring out risk behavior, it's very complicated. It's something that social scientists should, will continue to look into, and certainly room for more research by all means. So what can we do? What about our messaging out there? Again, I don't have all the answers. I don't have a silver bullet by any means, but I have noticed, just looking through the details, that routine seems to be the key. It's people on their way to work in the morning because it's their routine path that they take. It's taking kids home from school because it's their routine. It's as those bus driver examples depict. So I think with a flooded road, we need to get them out of that routine, whatever the case is. And I think that can go into messaging. So I applaud, again, offices that create scenario-based messaging for that particular instance going on. Try to get people to obey signage and barricades. There's some proof in some of this new research, especially that the people that have passed into high water versus not passed, that barricades do cut back on it, but don't stop everyone. Sometimes local officials may need to act quickly to get a road closed. And again, we'll have to look at the time of day. I'm not certainly going to say that the nighttime flooding thing is kind of false, but in some of the early looking I've done, time of day might not be as big a factor as just worrying about it at night. So it kind of leads into some of the future research, and again, there's a lot of room for research out there. Again, I'm just getting into time of day. Haven't really looked into depth of water or anything like that. What signage is most effective, and again, social behavior. There's a lot of room there. So in case you're not familiar with it, we do have kind of a somewhat internal website that's used for preliminary coordination. And if you are doing outreach and you want to know the latest numbers, we do try to keep this updated very, very quickly. And so it's off of the National Weather Service La Crosse's website at There is a move at headquarters to try to move this onto a national platform, but we'll see where that goes. And so kind of in closing here, I just, again, want to thank those that I've worked with at headquarters, folks at the regional office, and then some of the help that I get locally from my office and some of the people that have past worked on this research with me. So that is all I have, Bruce. I can open up to any questions or comments people might have.